Good morning. My Bible is open to John 13. John chapter 13 will be our starting point and also our main text this morning, John 13. You know, we spent a lot of time last month thinking about ways we could love like Jesus. We looked at that great command that we see there in the Gospels that we need to love God and to also love others. Then we looked at ways we could forgive like Jesus and finally closed out our focus last month by considering how we can love all people. You see, love is key for disciples of Christ. And even though the calendar has turned to another month, I do want to go back to that series, Love Like Jesus, to introduce our focus for the month of September. That is to serve like Jesus, to serve with purpose. What I'd like us to do today is look at John chapter 13 and the command that Jesus gives his disciples there in John chapter 13, and then look at the example Jesus gives us, and then close by looking at the application that Jesus himself makes to his disciples as he's trying to teach them there in his final days on earth. But as we think about the idea of serving like Jesus, I think we have to kind of admit, at least some of us have to admit, that sometimes serving doesn't come easy to some of us. Maybe we don't serve because we don't have the time. Maybe we feel like we can't serve because we don't have the ability, that we don't have the resources. Maybe we don't serve because we just feel uncomfortable serving. But that's what makes Jesus' teaching here in John chapter 13 so important for us, that as he's teaching his disciples, he makes it abundantly clear to all of us, I think, that Jesus expects his disciples to serve, to be on the front line serving one another. And this kind of reminds me of a story I read this week about a corporal there in the Revolutionary War. And this corporal and his unit, his soldiers, were put in charge of rebuilding this defensive wall there in the Revolutionary War. And they were working hard, and they were just not making good progress. And while they were working, all the corporal was doing is barking orders. Work faster, work harder, get this wall built as soon as possible, until this man came on his high horse, dressed in civilian clothes, and got off his high horse in his civilian clothes and started helping the soldiers rebuild this defensive wall. And when the wall was finally complete, he looked at the corporal and said, "Corporal, next time you need some help building a wall, call your commander-in-chief and he'll come help." See, that man who got off his high horse was George Washington. And that even though George Washington was commander-in-chief of the armed forces there in the Revolutionary War, he wasn't afraid to get off his horse and come down and stoop down and rebuild a defensive wall. Because he understood that if you're going to win a war, you got to have a wall. Everyone has to buy in. Everyone has to serve. And as we think about that example of everyone serving, maybe you think of somebody in your life, in a difficult time in your life, in a difficult moment in your life, someone who stooped down, got off their high horse, and served you in a time of need. And as you look back on that moment and what they did for you and the service they provided at that time, how did that make you feel? My guess is it probably made you feel a little loved. And why is that? Well, one of the best ways we can show our love for one another, which was our focus last month, right? Loving like Jesus. One of the best ways we can show our love, one of the best ways we can love like Jesus is by serving one another. And that's what makes Jesus' words here in John chapter 13 so powerful. Let's go and read John 13, verse 34 and 35, where Jesus says there in the text, "I give you a new command. Love one another. Just as I have loved you, you are also to love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another." As Jesus has gathered his disciples together here in John chapter 13, he's giving a very simple teaching. He looks at his disciples and says, "Guys, love is the mark that you are a disciple of Christ." That someone should be able to look at our life and our conduct as disciples of Christ and say, that person's a Christian. that person follows Christ. And do you know how I know that person follows Christ? Well, they love people. They love one another. That's how important it is for us as disciples of Christ to love one another. And so here in John chapter 13, verse 34 and 35, Jesus gives that call for disciples to love one another. And when we look at the entire Gospel of John, there's something at least I find pretty interesting here in John's Gospel. That in the first 12 chapters of John's Gospel, John uses the word love about like 5 or 6 times, I read. But in John 13 through 17, which is Jesus' final address, his farewell address to his disciples, his final teaching to his disciples on earth, he's about to die. John uses the word love something like Jesus uses the word love something like 31 times in 5 chapters. I think that's pretty interesting. That when Jesus is in his final hours here on earth, when he's giving his final instruction here on earth, the thing that's on his mind most of all is love. And he tells that to his disciples, that he thinks love is important. Here in John 13, Jesus tells his disciples that love is how people know that we are disciples of Christ, when we love one another. But look closely at the text again where Jesus says, just as I have loved you, you are also to love one another. How can we love like Jesus loved us? How can we love one another like Jesus loved us? Well, Chris talked a little bit about it last Sunday night in his attitude sermon, and he looked at Philippians 2, and I think Philippians 2 has some awesome instructions on how how we can love one another. We need to adopt the attitude that Christ had, and to look out for the interests of our brothers and sisters and not our own. We need to consider how we can build them up and how we can encourage them. We need to ask ourselves, how will this affect my brother? How will this affect my sister? And everything that we do in our life, we need to look for ways to reflect the love of Christ in our life. You see, loving one another as Christ has loved us is a powerful witness for the gospel of Christ. And we see that there in the first 400 years after Christ. In the first 400 years after Christ came to earth and died there on the cross, the Roman Empire was hit with several plagues. 2 big, serious plagues. And we know a little bit about plagues now after Corona. But after those 2 plagues, one of the things they noted is that the Christians were loving one another, that they were serving one another. To the point that one of the last pagan emperors of the Roman Empire, Julian the Apostate, wrote to his pagan priests saying, guys, y'all got to get your act together. Because these Christians are putting you guys to shame because you're not loving people. You're not serving people. When people are dying and suffering from all these plagues, you're not doing a thing. And these Christians are loving and they're serving people. See, one of the best ways we can heed and obey this call to love is by serving one another. And that's what we see Jesus talking about there at the very beginning of John chapter 13. John chapter 13, beginning in verse 1, it tells us there in the text that before the Passover festival, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart to this world to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Now, when it was time for supper, the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas, Simon Iscariot's son, to betray him. Jesus knew that the Father had given everything into his hands, that he had come from God and that he was going back to God. So he got up from supper, laid aside his outer clothing, took a towel and tied it around himself. Next, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet and dry them with the towel around him. It's the day before his crucifixion here in John chapter 13. Jesus knows, the text tells us, that his hour had come. You can imagine the emotion that he's feeling. The text tells us there in verse 1 that he loved his own who were in the world, that he loved them to the end. Think about that scene there in the upper room as Jesus is getting ready to die. He's gathered with his closest friends. He spent 3 years with these guys. He knows he's about to die. He knows he's about to be betrayed. He knows he's about to undergo tremendous emotional and physical pain. He knows he's going to be beaten. He knows he's going to be crucified. He knows he's going to die. And as he gathers with his disciples one more time as a group to share this meal together, his heart is aching. And his heart is breaking because he knows what he's about to go through. And he looks around the room, and what's on the disciples' mind? Well, Luke chapter 22 tells us that as Jesus is getting ready to die and they're celebrating this Passover meal, the disciples are arguing over who is the greatest in the kingdom. And as Jesus potentially hears those words about the disciples arguing who's the greatest in the kingdom, he looks around the room and he sees dirty feet. So he picks up that basin, he grabs a towel, and he begins to wash feet. While the disciples are arguing who is greater, what's on Jesus' mind? Jesus serves. He's about to die. He's about to be crucified. He's about to face excruciating pain there on the cross, but he is still thinking about others. That's why he washes feet there in John chapter 13. Now, foot washing was a job in the first century that you only left to your slave, to your servant, to the lowest man on the totem pole. And yet, what we look at Jesus' life, he's the one who takes that form of a servant and washes feet. Think about that for a second. That Jesus is Lord of heaven and earth. He's the one who should be served. He is the one who should be honored in this moment. He's about to give his life not only for his disciples, but for all of us. And yet here in John 13, he takes the servant's job and serves his disciples. That the one who should be served does the serving. And if that was our time in our life where we're about to die, I think a lot of us would probably be thinking the exact opposite of Jesus here. That if I knew I was about to die, the reaction I would have would be, hey, I'm about to die. You're going to serve me. You're going to help me. I want that nice, juicy steak. I want my last meal to taste really good. Give me that Chick-fil-A sandwich. Give me something good to eat. I want to be served. But that's not how Jesus thinks. Jesus shows his love for his disciples by serving them, even when he's about to die. And this shocked the disciples, particularly there in verse 6, it shocked Peter, who looks at Jesus and said, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? They know on some level how upside down and how backwards this is. And it's hard for us to understand how backwards this is in our culture today, I think. The closest example I can come up with is if the President of the United States was to visit your house for dinner, and you're sitting around the table and you're eating and you look around and you realize POTUS has nowhere to be found, you can't find the President. And you go in your kitchen to get a glass of water, and there he is doing your dishes. Or maybe you've invited the King of England over to your house, and he's over at your house, and you're wondering where he is, and all of a sudden you go to the bathroom and you find out that the King of England is cleaning your toilet. What Jesus is doing is extremely backwards. It's upside down. But what we see here in the text and what the text tells us is that Jesus loved them to the end. He served them to the end. But here in John 13, Jesus did something everyone else thought they were too high to be done. Everyone looked around and said, I am too good, I am too mighty, this is not a job for me, I'm not going to wash feet. But Jesus himself, Lord of heaven and earth, kneels down and washed their feet. All of their feet. Even the feet of Judas, who would betray him. And I think this teaches us two lessons. That first, no one is above serving. Jesus is Lord. He's about to die, but he still serves others. And Jesus is going to unpack this a little bit in the next section we'll look at here in a second. But second, no one is below being served. Not even Judas. And I think this one may be the hardest one for us to put into practice. Because I think a lot of us are okay serving our family. We're okay serving our friends. We're okay serving people that we know. But Jesus washed Judas's feet. He served the one who betrayed him. Jesus was not going to refrain from serving anyone. His life was dominated by service. He came to serve. And that's a reminder for all of us. And if we are going to love like Jesus, we need to serve like Jesus. And that's hard for us to do. It's hard for us to serve others like Jesus is teaching in the text. And that's the application he's going to draw there in verses 12 through 17. There in verses 12 through 17, the text tells us, when Jesus had washed their feet and put on his outer clothing, he reclined again and said to them, do you know what I have done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are speaking rightly, since that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, wash your feet, you ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should also do, just as I have done for you. Truly, I tell you in verse 16, a servant is not greater than his master, and a messenger is not greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. By his example there in the first 11 verses, Jesus shows us that no one is above serving. That even though Jesus is God, even though he's about to die, even though he's about to be crucified, he doesn't stop loving, he doesn't stop serving others. And there in verse 12, he turns to his disciples and says, do you understand what I have done for you? You know, it would have been easy for the disciples to go, yeah, I know what you just did. You just washed my feet. But John loves double meanings. He loves to stick deeper meanings behind the signs and the symbols that he uses and that he records in his gospel. And I think that's the case here. So when Jesus sits down with his disciples and puts on his outer garments again, and he asks the disciples, do you understand what I have done for you? He's not asking them to affirm that he's just washed their feet. He wants them to understand it's not about the foot washing, in fact. It's about the serving. That's why there in verse 13 and 14, he goes, you call me teacher, you call me Lord. You're right. But if I am teacher and I am Lord and I still served you, you need to serve one another. What Jesus is really doing here in John 13 is giving his disciples an example of humble service. He's trying to show them that loving someone means serving someone. And if our master humbly served others, then we need to do the same. Doesn't matter who we are. Doesn't matter what we do. We are called to serve one another. And that's a lesson I think we still need today. Because it's so easy for us to look at our lives and go, I have too much going on to serve. I've got to get this overtime. I've got this project at work. I've got to do this and that at home. I got no time to serve. It's easy for us to say, well, someone else can do it. I'm too important for this job. This other person has this talent, this ability, and that may be true. They may have that talent. They may have that ability, but still this text is powerful and it's convicting. Because Jesus is Lord of Lords and He's King of Kings. He's creator of heaven and earth, and yet what is He doing here in John 13? Jesus is still serving others. That even though Jesus is about to die on a cross for us, He still serves others. Do we understand what Jesus is trying to teach us here in the text? That yes, Jesus is teacher and Lord. Yes, that's correct. But if our Jesus, our teacher, our master, our Lord, our Savior washed feet, then we need to be busy washing feet and serving others. Why do we serve others? We serve others because Jesus tells us to here in this text. Why do we serve others? Because Jesus gave us an example to serve others here in this text. Why do we serve others? We serve others because a servant, we are not greater than our master. And if our master served, then we need to serve. And there are so many here at Union Road who do a great job serving. Just a week or so ago, we had a work day here. And about a couple months ago, we had another work day. In the last year or so, it feels like we have 2 or 3 work days. And it seems like every time we have a work day, we have like 30 guys show up with their sledgehammers and power tools I've never knew existed. And they're knocking down walls and they're doing all sorts of things. It's great to see so many guys and so many ladies willing to serve. That's awesome to see. And a couple of weeks ago, we launched our E-Team effort, that encouragement team that we're working on, trying to encourage members of our church family. Look for ways to make sure our shut-ins are loved and cared for. Look for ways our church family is loved and cared for. And I think the number I heard that Sunday night was like 38 people crammed in our back classroom. That's awesome to hear. So many people willing to serve. But what we need to realize is that we need every member of this church family to serve in some capacity. I do realize serving doesn't come naturally to some of us. It can be really hard for us to serve like Jesus. It can be really inconvenient for us to serve like Jesus. But when we look at John 13, Jesus reminds us that His example isn't just about the act of serving. I think Jesus' example is also about the attitude of serving. And I think that's where it gets hard for us. Because it's so tempting for us to say as we serve, look what I've done, look how I've served. But that's not the attitude Jesus has here in John 13. Jesus serves not out of pride, but out of love. And what we need to realize is that serving, even something as humble and lowly as washing feet, washing stinky, dirty feet, can be done arrogantly. It can be done with a hard heart. But Jesus' example here in the text, his example of humble service, challenges us to serve humbly. That serving others isn't just about duty, that duty to serve, because Jesus said so, I guess I got to serve. It's also about desire. It's about humble, sacrificial, Christ-like service. That's what it means to serve like Jesus. You see, serving like Jesus isn't about us. It's about others. And that means that no task is too small for us. No task is too insignificant for us. None of us are too small or too insignificant to serve in some capacity. It reminds me of a story I heard about Winston Churchill in World War II. The war against the Nazis and the Germans was raging, and he knew that if they were going to be successful, the British army was going to be successful, they needed coal to fuel the ships. And so he called the labor leaders of Britain into a room, and he told them, guys, picture this. Picture a parade after we've won the war. First is going to come the sailors who keep the sea lanes open. Then it's going to come the pilots who kept the air open from the Nazis. Finally, it's going to come the soldiers who fought Rommel in North Africa. And then are going to come the coal miners, covered in soot, dirty, stinky, filthy, but they'll be in that parade too because they helped win the war as well. You see, Winston Churchill realized that not all acts of service are glamorous. Not all acts of service are exciting. But all acts of service are necessary. And here in John 13, Jesus tells us that he expects all his disciples to be willing to serve, to love others, and to serve others just as Christ has served us. You see, I think if we open our eyes and we open our hearts to love, we'll see needs that we can meet through service. We'll see opportunities that we can step up and serve. We'll find ways that we can serve and we make a difference in the life of someone else. And if we're really doubting that serving can really make a difference, I want to lay this challenge before you. If you're struggling in your marriage, there's conflict in the house, and you're wondering what you can do to fix it, try serving your spouse. If you want to know how you can make your family better, how you can make your friendships better, stop looking for your friends and your family to serve us, but look for ways we can serve our families. Do we want to grow this church numerically and spiritually? If we want to grow with this church, we need to look for ways to serve one another. Do we want our kids and our grandkids to be passionate about Jesus? If that's the case, we need to serve one another. We need to look for ways to put Jesus' command into practice. Look what he says there in verse 17. He says, if you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. So it's not just enough for us to know I need to serve. Jesus says I need to put them into action. I need to serve others. We need to serve humbly. We need to serve passionately. We need to serve obediently because that's how Jesus served us. Jesus loved us so much, he cared for us so much, that he was willing to serve us by undergoing an excruciating experience, an excruciating death there on the cross, so that we who were separate from Christ, we who sinned, could be restored. And that even though we were aliens, even though we were strangers, separated from God, we could be once again adopted into his family, and we could cry out once again, I am his child. And we can make that cry because Jesus served us there on the cross. Maybe you're here today and you haven't been serving others. You haven't been serving obedient. You haven't been serving passionately. but you're ready to make a change. If we can help you with that change, we'd love to pray for you and pray with you. But maybe you're here today and you haven't begun serving God and you're ready to make that change. We'd love to help you with that this morning while together we stand and sing.